The bright spring sun beamed down on Westridge High School's annual track meet. 16-year-old Sophia Chen stood at the starting line, her slender frame tense with anticipation. Her dark ponytail swung as she adjusted her position, eyes focused on the track ahead. "On your mark," called the official. Sophia took a deep breath. "Get set." She lowered into position. The starting pistol cracked through the air. Sophia burst forward, her stride powerful and determined. She had trained all year for this moment. As she rounded the first curve, she was neck and neck with the girl from Jefferson High. The crowd's cheers grew louder, with her teammates shouting her name. Halfway through the race, Sophia pushed harder, pulling slightly ahead. Her breathing was controlled, her form perfect. This was her moment. The finish line was just ahead when suddenly her right foot caught in a small depression on the track. Time seemed to slow down. Sophia felt herself falling, her momentum carrying her forward. She hit the ground hard, her right leg twisting beneath her at an unnatural angle. A sickening crack echoed in her ears before pain exploded through her limb. Sophia, her coach, Mr. Reeves, was the first to reach her. The crowd fell silent as Sophia lay on the track, her face contorted in agony. "Don't move," Mr. Reeves said, kneeling beside her. "Someone call an ambulance." Tears streamed down Sophia's face as she clutched her leg. Through the haze of pain, she tried to reach for her phone. "I need to call my dad," she gasped. "We'll call them, don't worry," said Emma, her best friend who had rushed to her side. "Just try to stay still." Sophia nodded weakly. Her father, Dr. David Chen, would know what to do. He always did, but Emma's attempts to reach him went straight to voicemail. "He's at that medical conference in Tokyo," Sophia remembered, wincing as the pain intensified. "He won't be back until next week." The ambulance arrived 15 minutes later. The paramedics carefully placed Sophia on a stretcher, her leg temporarily stabilized. "We're taking her to Memorial General," one of them informed Mr. Reeves. "It's the closest hospital with a good orthopedic department." "I'm coming with her," Mr. Reeves said firmly. He turned to Emma. "Can you keep trying to reach her father?" The ride to Memorial General was a blur of pain for Sophia. She bit her lip to keep from crying out each time the ambulance hit a bump. What would her father say? Dr. Chen had warned her about pushing too hard in track, but she had been determined to break her personal record. What Sophia didn't know was that Memorial General had recently changed ownership. After years of serving as the hospital's head of cardiology, her father had quietly invested his savings and, with a group of other physicians, had purchased the controlling interest in the hospital just 1 month ago. The transition was still in progress, with many staff members unaware of the ownership change. As the ambulance pulled up to the emergency room entrance, Sophia caught sight of the hospital's sign, Memorial General Hospital. The irony was lost on her as waves of pain washed over her. This was her father's hospital now, though hardly anyone knew it yet. The paramedics wheeled her through the automatic doors into the busy ER. Little did Sophia know that her experience at Memorial General would be nothing like what her father would have wanted for any patient, let alone his only daughter. The emergency room at Memorial General Hospital buzzed with activity. Doctors rushed between curtained areas, nurses called out patient information, and the waiting area overflowed with people in various states of distress. It was, as the staff called it, one of those days. Nurse Valerie Harding hurried to the nurse's station, dropping a chart with a heavy sigh. Her 12-hour shift had stretched into 14 hours, and her feet throbbed inside her white shoes. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, evidence of 3 consecutive night shifts before this unexpectedly extended day shift. "We got another one coming in," called the charge nurse. "Teenage girl, leg injury from a track meet." Valerie barely suppressed an eye roll. In her 15 years as an ER nurse, she had developed a certain cynicism about teenage emergencies. "Put her in Bay 4, she said, reaching for a new intake form. "I'll get to her after I finish with the chest pain in 2. 20 minutes later, Valerie pulled back the curtain to Bay 4 where Sophia Chen lay, her face pale and drawn with pain. Mr. Reeves stood beside the bed, while a paramedic finished transferring information to the hospital staff. "Name?" Valerie asked, not looking up from her clipboard. "Sophia Chen," Mr. Reeves answered. "She's 16. We've been trying to reach her father, but he's overseas at a conference." Valerie nodded mechanically, taking Sophia's vitals and making notes. When she finally looked at the girl's leg, she noticed the swelling and unnatural angle, but her exhaustion clouded judgment minimized what she saw. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your pain? She asked. 9, Sophia whispered, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. Maybe 10, it's really bad. Valerie's lips tightened slightly. I'm sure it hurts, she said, her tone suggesting otherwise. The doctor will see you when he can. We have several critical cases ahead of you. But she's in agony, Mr. Reeves protested. Can't she at least get something for the pain? I can't prescribe pain medication without a doctor's orders, Valerie replied. And honestly, we see a lot of sports injuries. They look worse than they are. I'll flag her chart, but it might be a while. As Valerie turned to leave, Sophia called out, Please, I think something's really wrong. I heard it break. Try to relax, Valerie said over her shoulder. Tensing up will only make it hurt more. Outside the curtain, Valerie added Sophia's chart to a growing stack. In her mind, a teenage track injury paled in comparison to the elderly man with chest pains, the middle-aged woman with stroke symptoms, and the young child with a high fever. Her judgment, clouded by exhaustion and the day's stress, categorized Sophia as low priority. An hour passed, then 2. Mr. Reeves approached the desk 3 times, each request for attention met with increasing dismissiveness from Valerie. We're doing the best we can, she said firmly after his 3rd attempt. Unless she stops breathing, she'll have to wait her turn. What Valerie didn't know was that Sophia's injury was far more severe than a typical sports accident. The complex fracture was putting pressure on nearby blood vessels, and the prolonged wait without proper positioning or pain management was causing complications. By the 3rd hour, Sophia's leg had swollen dramatically, her skin taking on a concerning color. She drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain so intense she could barely speak. Mr. Reeves, growing increasingly desperate, stood at the nurse's station once more. Please, he said, his voice rising. Something isn't right. She needs help now. Valerie glanced toward Bay 4, irritation flickering across her tired face. I'll check on her when I can, she said. But we have protocols here, and she's not at the top of our list. Little did Nurse Harding know that her dismissive treatment of Sophia Chen would soon set in motion events that would change the course of her career and the future of Memorial General Hospital itself. The clock on the emergency room wall ticked past the 3-hour mark since Sophia's arrival. The bustling ER had only grown busier, with ambulance sirens wailing outside and new patients streaming through the automatic doors. In Bay 4, Sophia's condition had taken a frightening turn. Coach, I feel really weird, Sophia mumbled, her voice barely audible. Her face had lost all color, and a thin sheen of sweat covered her forehead despite the cool temperature in the room. The pain in her leg had transformed from sharp and intense to a strange, distant throbbing. Mr. Reeves, who had been pacing the small area, rushed to her side. Sophia, stay with me. He pressed the call button for the 4th time in the past 30 minutes. No response came. Emma, who had arrived at the hospital after finishing up at the track meet, gasped at her friend's appearance. This isn't right, she said, pulling out her phone. I'm going to keep trying to reach your dad. Mr. Reeves had reached his breaking point. He stormed out of Bay 4 and marched directly to the nurse's station, where Valerie was updating another patient's chart. That girl has been waiting for over 3 hours, he said, his voice rising enough that several people in the waiting area turned to look. She's getting worse. Her skin is gray, she's confused, and her leg looks twice its normal size. Valerie glanced up, annoyance flashing across her tired face. Sir, I understand you're concerned. We have patients with life-threatening conditions. This is life-threatening. Mr. Reeves slammed his hand on the counter. I'm not leaving this desk until a doctor sees her. Now. A young doctor passing by paused at the commotion. What's going on? He asked, looking between the agitated coach and the flustered nurse. Dr. Patel, Valerie began, this gentleman's student has a sports injury that. She has a broken leg that hasn't been treated for hours, Mr. Reeves interrupted. And now she's barely conscious. Dr. Amir Patel, a second-year resident with kind eyes and a quick mind, frowned. Which bay? 4, Mr. Reeves said, relief washing over his face as the doctor immediately headed in that direction. Inside Bay 4, Dr. Patel's casual demeanor vanished the moment he saw Sophia. He moved quickly to her side, checking her vitals and examining her leg with gentle but decisive movements. "How long has she been like this?" he asked sharply. "She started getting confused about 30 minutes ago," Emma explained. "And she says she feels cold, but she's sweating." Dr. Patel's expression darkened. "She's showing signs of shock." He turned toward the door and called out, "I need a trauma team in Bay 4, stat, and get X-ray in here immediately." The ER suddenly transformed around Sophia. Where there had been neglect, there was now urgent activity. Nurses, though not Valerie, rushed in with equipment. An orderly appeared with a portable X-ray machine. Dr. Patel inserted an IV line and started fluids while barking orders about medications and tests. "What's happening?" Sophia whispered, her voice small and frightened. "You're going to be okay," Dr. Patel assured her, though his expression remained serious. "You have a severe fracture that's been compromising blood flow to your leg. We need to get you into surgery right away." The X-rays confirmed Dr. Patel's suspicions. Sophia had suffered a complex femoral fracture with vascular involvement. Left untreated for hours, the condition had progressed to a dangerous point. From her station, Valerie watched the sudden flurry of activity with growing horror. The simple sports injury she had repeatedly deprioritized was now a full-blown emergency. She approached Bay 4 cautiously, only to be met by Dr. Patel's stern gaze. "This patient should have been seen immediately," he said, his voice low but intense. "This is a time-sensitive injury that could have resulted in permanent damage or worse." As Sophia was prepared for emergency surgery, a hospital administrator appeared, drawn by the unusual commotion. She glanced at the patient's chart and froze, her eyes widening in recognition. "Did you say Chen? Sophia Chen?" she asked, looking at the pale teenager being transferred to a gurney. "Yes," Mr. Reeves confirmed. "Do you know her?" The administrator's face paled nearly as much as Sophia's. "Call the OR and tell them to get their best team. And someone find me Nurse Harding. Now." Hospital Administrator Janet Morris paced outside the operating room, her sensible heels clicking against the polished floor. Every few seconds, she checked her phone, willing it to ring. The call to Tokyo had been placed 15 minutes ago, but with the time difference and Dr. Chen's busy conference schedule, reaching him was proving difficult. "Any update on the Chen girl?" asked Dr. Robbins, the chief of surgery, as he approached from the elevator. Janet's normally composed face showed rare strain. "They'd just taken her into surgery. Dr. Patel caught the vascular compromise just in time, if they waited any longer." "How did this happen?" Dr. Robbins asked, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. "A case like this should have been flagged as urgent immediately." "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Janet replied. "And more importantly, how I'm going to explain to Dr. Chen why his daughter was neglected in his own hospital for over 3 hours." Down in the ER, Nurse Valerie Harding was finishing her shift notes when a colleague tapped her shoulder. "Morris is looking for you," the other nurse said, her expression uncomfortable. "Something about the girl in Bay 4. Valerie frowned. "The track injury? She went to surgery. What's the problem?" "Apparently, she's someone important." A sense of unease crept through Valerie's exhaustion. "Important how?" "Her last name is Chen. As in, Dr. David Chen." The clipboard in Valerie's hands nearly fell to the floor. "The cardiology chief? The one who's part of the new ownership group?" Her colleague nodded grimly. "His daughter. And Morris is furious." The blood drained from Valerie's face as realization dawned. She had dismissed the daughter of not just a respected doctor, but one of the hospital's new owners. The implications were staggering. Meanwhile, in a conference room near the operating theaters, Mr. Reeves and Emma waited anxiously. Janet Morris entered, her expression carefully controlled. "How is she?" Emma asked immediately, jumping to her feet. "She's in surgery now," Janet replied. "Our best orthopedic surgeon is working on her. The good news is they believe they can repair the damage without lasting complications, but it was a close call." Mr. Reeves ran a hand over his face. "I kept telling them something was wrong. That nurse wouldn't listen." Janet's lips thinned. "I want to assure you that what happened today is being investigated and does not represent our standard of care, especially not for Dr. Chen's daughter." Emma looked up sharply. "You know Sophia's dad?" "Everyone at Memorial General knows Dr. Chen," Janet said. "He's been our head of cardiology for years, and last month he became part of the ownership group that purchased the hospital." Mr. Reeves's eyes widened. "Sophia's father owns this hospital?" "He's the majority stakeholder in the investment group," Janet confirmed. "The transition is still in progress, which is why not all staff are aware of the change. Dr. Chen wanted a quiet transition while he finalized his plans for improving the hospital's operations." At that moment, Janet's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and inhaled deeply. "It's Dr. Chen. Excuse me." She stepped into the hallway, pressing the phone to her ear. "David, it's Janet. Yes, she's in surgery now. The prognosis is good, but there was a significant delay in treatment that we're investigating. No, I think you should continue your conference. We have everything under control, and Sophia will be in recovery by the time you could get back. Of course, I'll personally oversee her care." As Janet spoke, Valerie Harding was escorted to the administration wing by her supervisor. The nurse's face was ashen, her hands trembling slightly as the gravity of her mistake became clear. "I had no idea," she whispered. "With the ER so packed, I just thought." "That's the problem," her supervisor cut in harshly. "You didn't think. You made assumptions about a patient's condition without proper assessment. And now, Dr. Chen's daughter nearly lost her leg on your watch." Valerie felt sick. In 15 years of nursing, she had never made such a serious error in judgment. And of all the patients to neglect, she had chosen the daughter of the hospital's new owner. As she approached the administration offices, Valerie wondered if this was the end of her career at Memorial General, or perhaps her nursing career altogether. The operating room hummed with tense concentration. Dr. Sarah Wilson, Memorial General's top orthopedic surgeon, stood over Sophia's draped form, her experienced hands working with precise movements. The surgical team moved around her in a well-practiced dance, instruments passing from hand to hand without a word being spoken. "Clamp," Dr. Wilson said, her voice steady despite the pressure. "We've got significant vascular damage here." The monitor's steady beeping provided a reassuring rhythm as Dr. Wilson navigated the complex repair. The fracture was worse than the X-rays had indicated, a severe compound break with the femur splintered in multiple places. Had Sophia received immediate attention, the repair would have been straightforward. After hours of compression and restricted blood flow, it had become a race against time. "BP's dropping," warned the anesthesiologist. "She's been under for almost 2 hours now." Dr. Wilson nodded without looking up. "Almost there. Just need to secure this last pin." Outside in the waiting area, Emma sat with her head on Mr. Reeves's shoulder. The coach had called Sophia's mother, who was on a business trip in Chicago and already boarding a flight to return home. The surgery had already gone an hour longer than expected, and the tension in the room was palpable. "What's taking so long?" Emma whispered. "Is that normal?" Before Mr. Reeves could answer, the doors at the end of the hall burst open. A tall man in a rumpled suit strode purposefully toward them, his face etched with worry. Despite his disheveled appearance, he carried himself with authority, his eyes scanning the area with quick intelligence. "Dr. Chen." Janet Morris hurried to meet him. "I thought you were staying in Tokyo." "I caught the first flight out," Dr. David Chen replied, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. 14 hours of travel. How is my daughter?" "Still in surgery," Janet explained, leading him toward a private consultation room. "Dr. Wilson is handling the procedure personally." Dr. Chen nodded, his expression tight. "And a nurse who neglected her?" "Valerie Harding. She's been placed on administrative leave pending review." Inside the consultation room, Janet handed Dr. Chen the case file. His eyes moved rapidly over the notes, his medical training allowing him to absorb the details quickly. With each page, his expression darkened. 3 hours and 17 minutes, he said quietly, looking up at Janet. "My daughter waited over 3 hours with a compound femoral fracture." "I can't explain it, David," Janet replied, her professional composure slipping to reveal genuine distress. "Nurse Harding has been with us for 15 years. She's never had an incident like this before." Dr. Chen was silent for a long moment. "I want to see everything. Staffing reports, ER admission logs, nurse-to-patient ratios for the last 6 months." "Of course," Janet agreed. "I've already pulled those for review." Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the surgical floor, Valerie Harding sat alone in a small conference room. She had been there for nearly 2 hours, waiting for what she assumed would be her termination meeting. Her nursing career flashed before her eyes. 15 years of dedicated service, thousands of patients cared for, countless lives touched, all potentially ended by one terrible lapse in judgment. Her phone vibrated with another text from her sister. "Any news yet? Should I come get you?" Valerie typed back, "Still waiting. Will call when I know something." Back in the operating room, Dr. Wilson placed the final suture and stepped back. "That's it. Let's get her to recovery." She looked at the clock on the wall. Nearly 3 hours of surgery for what should have been a routine procedure. The delay in treatment had complicated everything, but she was cautiously optimistic about Sophia's recovery. "She's young and healthy," Dr. Wilson told the team as they transferred Sophia to a gurney. "With proper follow-up and physical therapy, she should regain full function." As Sophia was wheeled toward recovery, Dr. Chen stood in the hallway, watching the doors of the operating theater. His daughter's future hung in the balance, as did the futures of Nurse Harding and potentially the entire hospital he had only just begun to reshape. Dr. David Chen sat beside his daughter's hospital bed, gently holding her hand. Sophia had awakened briefly after surgery, confused and groggy, before slipping back into a medicated sleep. Her right leg, now properly set and immobilized, was elevated on pillows. The steady beep of monitors provided a rhythmic background to Dr. Chen's racing thoughts. A soft knock on the door interrupted his vigil. Janet Morris entered, her face showing the strain of the past 12 hours. "David," she said quietly, "the board members have gathered in the main conference room. They're waiting for your decision about Nurse Harding." Dr. Chen looked down at his sleeping daughter. "What do they expect me to do?" "Most assume immediate termination," Janet replied. "Harrison is already talking about a potential lawsuit." Dr. Chen sighed deeply. "I want to speak with her first." "Speak with her?" Janet couldn't hide her surprise. "David, she neglected your daughter for over 3 hours. The surgical team said another 30 minutes could have meant permanent damage." "I'm aware," he said, his voice firm but calm, "but I won't make decisions based on anger or fear. 15 years of service deserves at least a conversation." 20 minutes later, the main conference room of Memorial General Hospital buzzed with tense voices. Hospital board members and administrators sat around the polished table, while Dr. Chen stood at the head, reviewing notes on his tablet. The room fell silent as the door opened and Valerie Harding entered, escorted by the nursing director. Valerie had spent hours preparing for this moment. She had changed into fresh scrubs, pulled her hair back neatly, and rehearsed what she would say. But seeing Dr. Chen in person, the father of the patient she had neglected, made her carefully planned words evaporate. "Please sit down, Nurse Harding," Dr. Chen said, gesturing to an empty chair directly across from him. Valerie sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel the stares of everyone in the room boring into her. "I assume you know why you're here," Dr. Chen began, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Yes, sir," Valerie replied, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I failed to properly assess and prioritize your daughter's condition, resulting in delayed treatment and complications." Dr. Chen studied her for a moment. "That's the clinical description, but I'd like to hear what happened in your own words. Not what you did wrong, but why it happened." This wasn't what Valerie had expected. She had prepared for accusations and dismissal, not an invitation to explain. She began, her voice faltering. She took a deep breath and started again. "Yesterday was my 4th consecutive shift. I was supposed to be off, but Maria's son was sick, and we're already short-staffed. The ER had 27 patients with 3 nurses when it should have had at least 6. She glanced around the room, noting the uncomfortable shifts in posture among the administrators. "That's not an excuse," she continued. "But when your daughter came in, I made an assumption based on incomplete assessment. I've seen hundreds of sports injuries, and I categorized hers as non-urgent. It was a terrible mistake, and one I'll never forgive myself for." Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "How many patients were you responsible for during that shift?" 11, Valerie answered, "including 3 critical cases." "And how many hours had you worked in the past week?" 56, she said quietly, "with only 1 day off." Dr. Chen turned to the nursing director. Is that within hospital policy? The nursing director shifted uncomfortably. We've been dealing with severe staffing shortages. Many nurses have been working overtime. I see. Dr. Chen looked back at Valerie. One more question, Nurse Harding. If you could change anything about how Memorial General operates, what would it be? The question caught Valerie off guard. She had expected to be fired, not asked for her opinion on hospital operations. She hesitated, looking around at the stern faces of the board members. Then something inside her broke. If this was her last act as a nurse at Memorial General, she would speak the truth. I would fix the broken triage system, she said firmly. I would ensure appropriate staffing levels so nurses aren't making life or death decisions while exhausted. And I would implement better communication protocols between departments so critical information doesn't get lost. The room fell silent. Dr. Chen looked at Valerie with new interest, seeing not just the nurse who had neglected his daughter, but perhaps someone who understood the deeper problems he had hoped to address as the hospital's new owner. The conference room remained silent after Valerie's honest outburst. Board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, while Janet Morris studied her notes with sudden intensity. Only Dr. Chen seemed calm, his fingers lightly tapping the table as he considered Valerie's words. Thank you for your candor, he finally said. Now, I'd like to share something with all of you. He tapped his tablet, and the large screen on the wall lit up with a series of graphs and charts. Before I invested in Memorial General, I conducted a thorough analysis of its operations, Dr. Chen explained. What I found was troubling. Nurse-to-patient ratios have declined steadily over the past 5 years. Air wait times have increased by 40%. Staff turnover is at an all-time high. He swiped to a new slide showing staff schedules. In the last month alone, 37 nurses worked double shifts, 10 worked more than 60 hours in a week. This isn't just about one nurse making a bad decision. It's about a system that's setting our staff up to fail. Harrison Wells, the most senior board member, cleared his throat. With all due respect, Dr. Chen, while these issues may exist, they don't excuse Nurse Harding's negligence toward your daughter. No, they don't. Dr. Chen agreed, looking directly at Valerie. What happened to Sophia is unacceptable, and there must be consequences. Valerie nodded, her eyes downcast. This was it, the end of her career. However, Dr. Chen continued, firing Nurse Harding won't solve the underlying problems. In fact, it might make them worse by putting even more pressure on our already strained nursing staff. He turned back to the board members. My daughter's experience has shown me that the changes I plan to implement can't wait. They need to happen immediately. From her seat, Valerie watched in confusion. This wasn't going the way she had expected. I don't understand, she said quietly. Aren't you going to fire me? Dr. Chen studied her for a long moment. Nurse Harding, you made a serious mistake that nearly cost my daughter her ability to walk. As a father, I'm angry and hurt. But as a doctor and now an owner of this hospital, I need to look at the bigger picture. He walked around the table until he stood beside her chair. Yesterday, you worked your 4th consecutive shift in an understaffed ER with nearly triple the recommended patient load. You were set up to fail by a system that prioritizes cost-cutting over patient care. But I should have recognized the severity. Valerie began. Yes, you should have, Dr. Chen interrupted. And that's why there will be consequences. You'll be suspended without pay for 2 weeks. You'll complete additional training in triage assessment and emergency orthopedic care, and you'll be on probation for 6 months. Valerie blinked back tears, not of sadness, but of shock and relief. You're not firing me? No, Dr. Chen said simply. I believe in second chances, especially when the first chance was compromised from the start. He returned to the head of the table. As for the rest of us, we have work to do. I'm implementing immediate changes to staffing policies. No more than 3 consecutive shifts, mandatory rest periods, triage nurses dedicated solely to assessment with no patient care duties to distract them. The board members shifted uncomfortably, no doubt calculating the costs of these changes. But David, Harrison protested, these changes will impact our bottom line significantly. Dr. Chen's expression hardened. My daughter nearly lost her leg because our bottom line took priority over patient care. That ends today. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each person, I didn't buy this hospital to make money. I bought it to fix a broken system. What happened to Sophia was terrible, but if it serves as the catalyst for real change, then perhaps some good can come from it. Valerie sat in stunned silence. In her 15 years of nursing, she had never witnessed a hospital administrator, let alone an owner, take responsibility in this way. Dr. Chen, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, thank you for the second chance. I promise I won't let you down. Dr. Chen nodded solemnly. It's not just about my daughter, Nurse Harding. It's about every patient who walks through our doors. They all deserve the best care we can provide. As the meeting continued, with plans for immediate reforms taking shape, Valerie realized that this wasn't just a second chance for her. It was a second chance for Memorial General Hospital itself. 6 months after Sophia Chen's accident, Memorial General Hospital was almost unrecognizable. The once chaotic emergency room now ran with surprising efficiency. New nurses moved confidently between patient bays, following clearly established protocols. A large digital board displayed current wait times and staff assignments, all carefully balanced to prevent overload. In the center of this transformed environment stood Valerie Harding, clipboard in hand as she guided a young nursing student through triage procedures. Always check the injury site yourself, Valerie explained, demonstrating a proper assessment on a patient with a sprained wrist. Never rely solely on what you're told or what you expect to see. The student nodded earnestly, taking careful notes. Is that what you learned from the Chen case? Valerie paused, the memory still fresh despite the months that had passed. Yes, she admitted. It's a lesson I'll never forget. After completing the demonstration, Valerie made her way to the hospital's rehabilitation center. Through the glass doors, she could see Sophia Chen working with a physical therapist, carefully putting weight on her healing leg. At 17 now, Sophia had recovered remarkably well, though the road had not been easy. Valerie knocked gently before entering. How's our star patient doing today? The physical therapist smiled. Making excellent progress. She might even be ready for light jogging next month. Sophia looked up, her expression brightening when she saw Valerie. What had begun as an uncomfortable relationship had, surprisingly, developed into something like friendship. Nurse Harding, did you bring it? Sophia asked eagerly. Valerie smiled, pulling a folder from her clipboard. Hot off the press. The official protocols for the new student-athlete emergency care initiative. Sophia took the folder reverently. This project had been her idea, a special training program teaching coaches and school athletic staff how to recognize serious injuries and provide proper immediate care. Dad's going to love this, Sophia said, flipping through the pages. He's presenting the program to the school board next week. Speaking of Dr. Chen, the man himself appeared in the doorway, looking much more rested than he had 6 months ago. His initial hands-on approach to hospital reform had gradually evolved into a more sustainable leadership style. Valerie, there you are, he said. The task force is gathering for the quarterly review. We need our patient advocacy director present. Valerie still felt a small thrill whenever her new title was mentioned. After her probation ended, Dr. Chen had created the position specifically for her, recognizing that her unique perspective as both the person who had failed and the person committed to fixing that failure made her invaluable to the hospital's transformation. I'll be right there, she promised. As Dr. Chen waited, he watched his daughter continue her exercises, pride evident in his expression. What had begun as a potential tragedy had become the catalyst for remarkable change. You know, he said quietly to Valerie, sometimes I wonder if all this would have happened without that terrible day. Valerie considered this. I hope we would have found another way, she replied honestly. But I'm grateful that something good came from my mistake. Later that afternoon, the task force, comprised of doctors, nurses, administrators, and even former patients, gathered in the conference room. The walls were covered with charts showing dramatic improvements in patient outcomes, staff satisfaction, and operational efficiency. 6 months ago, this hospital was failing its patients and its staff, Dr. Chen began. Today, we're becoming a model for hospital reform across the state. Valerie looked around the table at her colleagues, many of whom had been skeptical of Dr. Chen's vision at first. Now they were all believers. Our work isn't done, Dr. Chen continued. But today, I want to acknowledge how far we've come. He glanced at Valerie, a look of respect passing between them. 6 months ago, they had been adversaries, the negligent nurse and the angry father. Now they were partners in a mission larger than either of them. As the meeting progressed, Valerie's phone lit up with a text from Sophia. PT says I might be ready for track by spring season. Valerie smiled, typing back, "One step at a time. We'll get you there safely." That was the true transformation at Memorial General, not just new protocols or staffing levels, but a fundamental shift in how they saw patient care as a journey taken together, with both patients and providers walking side by side toward healing.